بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We pick up where we left off last time. If you're with us here, you might remember Imam al-Ba'li rahimahullah ta'ala ending with him saying, وَيُقَوَّمُ أرض التجارة وهو ما يعد للبيع والشراء لأجل الربح بالأحظ للفقراء من ذهب أو فضة. So trade goods are appraised according to whichever standard gold or silver is more beneficial to the poor. We talked a little bit about that. And the next section is on Zakāt al-Fiṭr. He says, Zakāt al-Fiṭr ṣadaqah واجبة بالفطر من رمضان وتسمى فرضا ومصرفها كزكاة ولا يمنع وجوبها دين إلا مع طلب وتجب على كل مسلم إذا كانت فاضلة عن نفقة واجبة يوم العيد وليلته وما يحتاجه من مسكن وخادم ودابة وكتب علم يحتاجها لنظر وحفظ وثياب بذلة ونحوه. So we're opening up here. Zakāt al-Fiṭr, he says, is an obligatory charity at the end of Ramadan. It is a designated obligation distributed as zakat. And its obligation is not waived by debt except when demanded. It is an obligation upon every Muslim provided it is surplus to obligatory expenses for the day and night of Eid, as well as one's residence, servant, riding mount, books of knowledge needed to study and memorize, daily clothing, and the like. All right, so obviously we've started a new topic into Zakāt al-Fiṭr. He's mentioning it as an obligatory charity that's given at the end of Ramadan for every Muslim, male or female, young or old, free or in bondage, rich or poor, and it's not tied to owning a nisab, as we've covered before with wealth, produce, animals, etc. Instead, it's due from everyone who has more than their own needs and those of their dependents for the day and night of Eid. So that would be the nisab, essentially. If we wanted to say there's a nisab for Zakāt al-Fiṭr, that would be it, meaning you have to have a surplus beyond your needs and those in your care for the night and day of Eid. Even if the surplus is less than 1 sa', and we're going to talk about the measure of a sa' here, that's a dry measure of volume. If the surplus is equivalent to less than 1 sa', that portion must be given. Debts do not cancel the obligation unless repayment is being demanded immediately. He mentions that explicitly, in which case the debt is prioritized. So we talked about how the debt can cancel out the obligation of Zakāt al-Mal, which is the zakat or the alms that are due on your wealth every year. And in the event that you have a debt that diminishes the minimum threshold of that obligation, then that is accounted for and could potentially avoid that obligation for you. Here in this case, we're not going to consider any debts. We're just going to look at what's available for the day and the night of Eid. The only way the debt is considered is if the person that is owed money is now asking for it right away. Like, I want payment now. I need my repayment now. Then you'll prioritize that repayment then and there. Zakāt al-Fiṭr is therefore a way. We consider it with these various different rules. It's a way to ensure that every Muslim shares their Eid blessings with others, starting from whatever little they can spare. The idea here is to bring in the day of Eid with happiness and joy with the entire community, such that we don't leave anybody worried about fulfilling the needs of that day. We want everyone to enjoy the moment and not be stressed, well, what am I going to eat today? So here you go. This is what you're going to eat today so that you can just not be worried and just enjoy in the celebration, bringing in these very special moments as a community. There's also a spiritual impact of this expenditure, as the Prophet ﷺ indicated. So not only is there a social impact, which is very positive, there's a very important spiritual element to this, because the Zakāt al-Fiṭr is a means of purification for the one who has fasted, purifying them from sin that's been committed. And this is as the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, or it's been mentioned here in the hadith found in Sunan Abi Dawood and Ibn Majah. It says, فَرَضَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ زَكَاةَ الْفِطْرِ تُهْرَةً لِلصَّائِمِ مِنَ اللَّغْوِ وَالرَّفَثِ وَطُعْمَةً لِلْمَسَاكِينِ. So the Messenger of Allah obligated Zakāt al-Fitr as a purification for the fasting person from idle talk and indecent speech, and as a means of feeding the poor. Again, you can see here the combination of these two elements at play, a spiritual one and a social one in the same act. So in the event that while fasting you made some slips here and there, indecent speech, idle talk, maybe abusive, uncalled for, blameworthy, this is a means by which those things will be purified. He says, we go on to the next section here. He says, فَيُخْرِجُ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَعَنْ كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ يَمُونُهُ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ لِجَمِيعِهِمْ بَدَأَ بِنَفْسِهِ فَزَوْجَتِهِ فَرَقِيقِهِ فَأُمِّهِ فَأَبِيهِ فَوَلَدِهِ فأقرب في الميراث وتسن عن جنين وتجب بغروب شمس ليلة عيد الفطر وتجوز قبله بيومين فقط ويومه قبل الصلاة أفضل وتكره في باقيه ويحرم تأخيرها عنه وتقضى وجوبا. Here he talks about the distribution of this zakat. It's distributed on behalf of oneself and every Muslim under their care. If one cannot provide for all, he begins with himself, then his wife, his servant, his mother, his father, his child, and then those closest in inheritance. It's recommended to give it on behalf of a fetus. It becomes obligatory at sunset on the night of Eid al-Fitr, permissible to give up to 2 days before, preferable on the day itself before the prayer, disliked for the remainder of the day, and impermissible to delay beyond it, though it must then be made up. So distributing Zakāt al-Fitr is distributed like that of Zakat, the designated recipients of Zakāt al-Fitr are the same as those for Zakat al-Mal, which we're going to talk about shortly. Then we're talking about the order of who you pay on behalf of. So the order of giving Zakāt al-Fitr follows the same order of financial maintenance, because it depends on it depends on who one is responsible for, basically. So you have to determine who you are responsible for financially, and then you structure your distribution of Zakāt al-Fitr based on that list of priorities. And as he mentions there, we have an order that we go in. So if your wealth, what you have, your provisions that you have to give for Zakāt al-Fitr is limited, then you begin and you proceed in that order as he's designated. So if someone doesn't have enough to pay for everyone under their care, they must start with themselves first, because just as they must provide for their own needs first, their own fitrah comes first too. You have to provide for yourself first. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ. And this is also based in the Qur'an when Allah says, save yourselves and your families. So yourselves giving priority here, getting priority here. And then your fitrah is also an obligation upon you. You can't skip that obligation to fulfill an obligation of another without yours first being fulfilled. So the fitrah has to come first for the one who is responsible for others. Next is his wife. Even if she is in bondage, whether she came under his ownership either that day or that night of Eid, he is responsible for that. Her maintenance is always obligatory, unlike that of relatives. Other relatives might not always be obligatory. The nature of the marriage contract requires maintenance. We have to remember that. Unless the wife foregoes that maintenance from the beginning of the marriage and agrees, or at some point she agrees at some point along the marriage that, look, I no longer require you to fulfill this right. I waive this right of mine. Then that maintenance that is required typically, or I should say, which is built into the nature of the marriage contract, is no longer obligatory. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the state, the situation. She's always obliged such maintenance. Which is similar to that's a right of the wife over the right of the wife of the husband is that the husband's providing a basic standard of living, food, clothing, shelter. And then the husband's right as the essential element of the marriage contract is intimate access. Those are the understandings of when you get into a marriage contract in Islam. That's the basic understanding of what you've agreed to. So this is a binding right based on the contract, and so that's why the wife takes priority above all others. Then comes his bond servants, because their upkeep is also required. Even if the man is financially struggling in the event that he had bond servants, this is more theoretical for us today than anything else, but just to understand the prioritization, why that's there. Because their upkeep is required. One of the great Hanbalī, Ibn Aqil, he noted that the bondservant might even deserve to come before the wife, since they would otherwise be completely neglected. The bondservant, that is. They would be completely neglected. They don't have any other avenue. Then his mother, because in terms of kindness and dutiness, she comes before the father. This is reported in the hadith, who is most deserving of my company. The Prophet ﷺ said, your mother. That was said 3 times, and then he said, your father. Also, so that's the next one after the mother. It's also, anta wa maluka li abik, as the hadith says, you and your wealth belong to your father. Then the children, since supporting them is also a general requirement. And after that, it follows the order of inheritance. When you look at inheritance law, it's structured. There is a schedule of priority there for inheritance. And so you will begin with the first relative on that list of priorities, just like you would when you're inheriting your wealth. And if multiple people are equally deserving to be paid for, like, for example, if you had 2 sons or 2 siblings, and you couldn't afford to pay the Zakāt al-Fiṭr for both of them, then you would draw lots to decide the matter, whose zakat will be paid. Since there's no other way to determine a priority, and you don't want to go picking a favorite, you have to just draw lots, and then that will determine how the priority is set. So the fitrah becomes obligatory. So this payment is obligatory at sunset on the day of Eid al-Fitr. I should say on the night of Eid al-Fitr, the night coming before the day. Anyone who enters Islam, marries, or acquires a dependent after that point is not responsible for their fitrah until the next year. It's noted, it's also permissible to give it 1 or 2 days before Eid. It's permissible to prepay, essentially, as the companions were reported to have done this. But best to give it before the Eid prayer itself is made. That day, the morning of, it's best to give it out, especially before the prayer. Giving it later that day is disliked. So in the event that you're running behind and you pray Eid and you haven't given out your Zakāt al-Fiṭr, you're going to give it out, it's disliked, makruh. Delaying it beyond that, meaning the day, is sinful, However, it must be made up. You can't forego your obligation. You have to pay it. وَهِيَ صَاعٌ مِّن بُرٍّ أَوْ شَعِيرٍ أَوْ تَمْرٍ أَوْ زَبِيبٍ أَوْ أَقِطٍ وَالْأَفْضَلُ تَمْرٌ فَزَبِيبٌ فَبُرٌّ فَأَنْفَعُ فَإِنْ عُدِمَتْ أَجْزَأَ كُلُّ حَبٍّ يُقْتَاتُ وَيَجُوزُ أَنْ تُعْطِيَ الْجَمَاعَةُ فِطْرَتَهُمْ لِوَاحِدٍ وَعَكْسُهُ. So it's a measure of 1 sa'ah. Its measure is 1 sa'ah of wheat, barley, dates, raisins, or dried yogurt. The best is dates, then raisins, then wheat, then whatever is most beneficial. If those are unavailable, any staple grain will suffice. It is permissible for a group to give their fitr to one person and vice versa. So the obligation of 1 sa'ah, as I mentioned, is a dry volume, not weight. It's an amount. It's about 2.5 liters in volume. And that is equal to 4 double handfuls. If you were to cup both of your hands together, the average size hands cupped together to make this scoop, you would take 4 of those essentially of staple food, such as wheat, barley, dates, raisins, dried yogurts, and then you can move on outside of that into the things that are storable. Storable foods. The best is dates, and the reason for that is because not only is it a storable food, but it's sweet. So it's a sweet, storable food. Ready to eat. Okay, and it's Eid. So it's a great sweet treat as well as something that they can store for the day or beyond the day. They're also readily available, and dates are typically very affordable. More affordable perhaps than other food types, and that may depend on where you live. Then raisins, then wheat, then whatever is most beneficial. If those are unavailable, as he mentions, you can get rice, you can get corn, you can get lentils, beans, anything that's storable. You don't want to give fresh foods because they'll spoil. Anything that you can get that's storable and is considered a staple type of food or grain, that will suffice, inshallah. You're not going to give, like I mentioned, like bread, fresh bread and things of that nature. They'll go off and it will have been a waste. Also, a household can combine portions and give them to a single person. So a person that's a recipient of Zakāt al-Fiṭr may end up getting much more than they need for the day. And then that would, of course, be a great gift for them. Not only would they enjoy it without worry on Eid, but it can continue further for them. And one needy person's portion may be shared among multiple recipients. So it's possible that you have paying Zakāt al-Fiṭr for yourself, and you may say, well, standing in front of me, there's more than one person. I have 2 or 3 people, they want something for Zakāt al-Fiṭr, and I can divide my Zakāt al-Fiṭr into portions. So I don't have to give them my entire portion doesn't go to one. It's like one portion goes to one person. I can divide that, at least so that it's a reasonable amount. And I give it. So like if there were 30 people and I broke it down, it would be like they're not getting anything. It's not even worth the gesture. But a couple people there, you can break it in half and they'd have a decent sized portion for at least a meal or 2. So that's also possible. So meaning here that the distinction is that he's basically showing the permissibility of giving a whole lot, like you've got 10 people you're paying for to one person, and then taking one person's Zakāt al-Fiṭr and giving it to multiple people. That's perfectly fine to do. Right? As long as it's a reasonable amount. Such as like a mud. Right? So we said arba'atu amdad, which is 4 double hand scoops. That's 4 of these. So like 4 people, I could give that amount. And then when you start going 5 and 6, it starts to diminish the amount, as I mentioned. So it's no longer worth the effort. So at that point, you just give what you can in a reasonable amount, such as a mud, 1/4 of the 2.5 liters, etc. Yeah. It fulfills your obligation. It's sinful to go beyond the point. So I think, you know, those types of opportunities for expiation are based on avoiding sinful things, and Allah knows best. Yeah. should be distributed. Should be distributed. Let's look at the next section. We'll get to that point. He says in the next section about distribution, يجب إخراج الزكاة فورا كنذر وكفارة إن أمكن وله تأخير لعذر ومن جحد وجوبها عالما كفر ولو أخرجها ومن منعها بخلا أو تهاونا أخذت منه وعزر من علم تحريم ذلك. It's obligatory to pay zakat immediately, if possible, just as with a vow or expiation. Its delay is permitted only with an excuse. Whoever knowingly denies its obligation has committed disbelief, even if they discharge it. Whoever withholds it out of miserliness or negligence will have it taken from them, and whoever knows the prohibition of such will be disciplined. Okay, so here is important rulings on distribution. The first is that zakat must be paid right away, as long as no harm will come to the payer, the collector, or the wealth itself. The principle is an unrestricted command requires immediacy. That's the principle behind this, meaning that when there's an obligation, it means fawran. You have to do it right away, unless there's something that would stipulate otherwise. And this is from the principle, this is like from usul al-fiqh, the principles of this field, is that in the madhab, when you have an obligation, not only does it mean it's binding, but it has a time, which is right away. It has to be fulfilled immediately, unless there's something to indicate that it can be delayed. So something that we'll get to here is like Hajj, for example. Allah commands us to make Hajj when we've met certain conditions. Once those conditions are met, then it becomes an obligation to perform right away in the Hanbalī madhab. Other madhabs, they might say, it becomes an obligation, but you can delay. So I may meet the conditions this year, but it's just not the right time for me based on other circumstances, or I'm just not into it right now, I don't want to go. It's not the right season for me, or whatever it may be. So I'm going to wait a couple of years and then I'll end up going. That might be fine according to the principles of other schools, but in the madhab of the Hanabila, they say, nope, once you become obliged, you have to go right away. So in this case, there are obviously some circumstances in which the immediacy could be waived, and that's if there's going to be harm. So for example, if it was known that, and this, if we're thinking like maybe in less safe environments, if I go out right now, there's a group of people that are waiting that are going to rob me. Or if the collector comes to take it and then distribute it, he'll get robbed. So those are some circumstances by which a person might forego the obligation, or that obligation would be foregone. However, it must be paid. So whoever knowingly denies the obligation of zakat after being informed of its ruling has committed disbelief, even if they still pay it. So this is an important point to note here, that a person denying the obligation of zakat has to be established with sound proof. And this is typically, well, this is the job of the qadi, the Muslim judge. So there has to be an apparatus in place to make this ruling. There's a ruling, these rulings, they have, there's an effect to making such a ruling. There's a binding impact to these rulings. They're not just like anyone can make these rulings on another person. But there needs to be an official apparatus, which would be the court system of Islam. And then that person will be brought forth, and then they would be presented with evidence, and then they would go through a rigorous process of trying to remove doubts and misunderstandings, such that they were making a determination upon clarity. And then after that was considered to have been done, and they still said, nope, it's not an obligation, then it would be ruled that they had committed, that they had become apostates. They had disbelieved because they denied what Allah has commanded. Even if they say it's not an obligation, but to avoid the trouble, I'll still pay it as like a voluntary form of charity. I'll just still do it because I'm a nice charitable person, generous person. The fact that, so it's not simply about the act itself, it's about also a person's belief and acceptance of Allah's commands as being irrefutable. So even if they still gave it as he says, and they still denied the obligation, that wouldn't change the ruling that the judge would pass in that case. So in this event, essentially what happens is, as I said, they're called, obviously, to accept the obligation, to repent from this denial. Otherwise, yeah, they would be judged as apostates. Then you might have someone who, on the other hand, withholds their zakat out of stinginess or negligence. They don't deny its obligation, they're just being stingy. In this case, it's taken by force. And there's an apparatus for this as well. It's a state-run apparatus in which those that are employed or charged by the state to manage the zakat or collect the zakat, they'll go, and if the person is withholding for this reason, then they'll just take the asset. They wouldn't be deemed as an apostate because they believe that it's an obligation. They're just not fulfilling that obligation because I just don't want to give I don't want to give anything away. And then if they know that this is that this is impermissible to withhold, like they're sinful for withholding, then there could be some reprimand or some discipline that may happen after that. And if necessary, they would be fought until they comply. And we can review the story of Mani'i Zakat at some point. This happened after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. There were those that they denied the obligation of zakat. They said, now that the Prophet's passed away, we don't need to pay zakat anymore. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had to go and handle the state's business and establish the religion in totality. There is an exception here. Zakat is withheld only out of concern that the ruler will not distribute it properly. And this does not amount to disbelief. So if a person believed that that was the apparatus that the state collects the zakat, and they're the ones that distribute it, and you believed that they're not distributing it properly, then potentially you would be excused for withholding it in that case. He goes on and he says, وَيَلْزَمُ أَنْ يُخْرِجَ عَنِ الصَّغِيرِ وَالْمَجْنُونِ وَلِيُّهُمَا وَشُرِطَ لَهُ نِيَّةٌ كَمَالِهِ وَسُنَّ لِمُخْرِجٍ إِظْهَارُهَا وَحَرُمَ نَقْلُهَا إِلَى مَسَافَةِ قَصْرٍ إِنْ وُجِدَ أَهْلُهَا وتجزئ وإن كان المزكي في بلد وماله في آخرة أخرج زكاة المال في بلد المال وأخرج فطرته وفطرة لزمته في بلد نفسه ويجوز تعجيلها لحولين فقط إذا كمل النصاب لا منه للحولين. The guardian of a minor or the insane must pay it on their behalf, and its validity requires intention, as with their own wealth. It is recommended to make it public. It is prohibited to transfer it beyond the distance of shortening if its recipients are present, though it is valid. If the one obliged is in one land while their wealth is in another, zakat is paid in the land of the wealth, whereas fitra, their own and that of those they support, is paid in their place of residence. It is impermissible to pay in advance for no more than 2 years once the nisab has been met, but not to pay from it for the 2 years to come. So let's look at this quickly, unpack some of what the Imam is saying here. So first, zakat is obligatory, and that's even, as we've discussed, even from the wealth of the minors and the mentally ill, because there's an issue of taklif that is associated with a minor, as well as someone who has lost their mental faculties. As we know, minors under the age of puberty are not mukallaf, meaning morally responsible or obliged, as is the mentally ill, someone who's lost their ability to understand things. Then they're no longer morally capable. They don't have this capacity by which they're held accountable. So zakat is still obligatory. The zakat for them still must be paid. and their guardian is the one that will pay it for them on their behalf, just as with any other necessary expense that the guardian would shoulder for the minor, as well as those who are lacking mental capacity. And the validity requires an intention. Just like when they give their own wealth, they intend, they have to also have an active intention to give the wealth of those that they're taking care of. As the Prophet says, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, as we very much know, the Prophet's famous words and deed actions are by their intentions. So the intention should be made at the time of giving or shortly before, and it suffices if the ruler or a collector distributes it on the owner's behalf. And so it's possible that the guardian can appoint a trustee to distribute it, or someone that can act as a proxy. There's nothing wrong with having that done, and they basically make the intention for the one they're giving on behalf of that this is their zakat. We're intending this is their zakat. It's being, the obligation is being fulfilled. It's best to distribute zakat locally to the poor in one's region, and that depends on what type of zakat that's being paid, of course. So he says here, talking about impermissibility to transport zakat beyond the distance of shortening prayer if there are needy people present within that radius. If the zakat is transported outside of that radius, it'll suffice, but it's considered sinful unless there's a valid excuse. Right? Obviously, one of the valid excuses would be there's no eligible recipients, or there's fear of harm coming to that wealth within that radius. Fear of harm coming to the one paying, fear of harm coming to the one that's delivering, perhaps. So the type of zakat depends on where it's to be distributed. So if wealth is located in another land, zakat is paid where the wealth is. So, for example, if you have a herd of animals off in another neighboring region, then that's where the zakat is distributed, in that neighboring region. So the wealth of that physical wealth serves that physical location that it's in. Okay? So if you have a business that has commercial commodities that are sitting around and you have to pay zakat on them, and that business is located far overseas somewhere, then the zakat is distributed in that region, as opposed to Zakāt al-Fiṭr. So that's Zakāt al-Mal or livestock or whatever it may be. As opposed to Zakāt al-Fiṭr, Zakāt al-Fiṭr is distributed where you are as a person, because you're going to be serving the community in which you're celebrating the Eid. So in the event that you're from your hometown, you're out of your hometown on Eid, like you've gone out and spent the last, let's say, 10 nights of Ramadan and are going to spend Eid, you're going to make itikaf in Masjid al-Haram, for example, if you were so blessed for such a great occasion. You're going to spend it in Mecca, then in that case, the distribution would not be in your hometown where you left, because you're not there present celebrating with those people. You're in another place celebrating with other people, and you're supposed to be able to help out the people in which you are residing to celebrate in the same fashion. It's also permissible to prepay zakat for up to 2 years in advance. As the Prophet allowed his uncle al-Abbas to do this. Prepayment is only valid once the nisab is reached and not from the wealth expected in the future. You don't want to also diminish the nisab when prepaying. It suffices to do this, but it's not preferred. So you could potentially estimate, if you wanted to, and prepay the zakat. It may be of some advantage. There may be some advantages to doing that. He's going to prepay it for this year and the next year. that amount. So what happens if the amount increases
No,
or decreases?
you give,
It would decrease.
so now for the second year group, the same amount, they both going to be the same amount?
Yeah. What you're saying is once you've taken a portion out of it, then you have to subtract that from the total that you're calculating for those 2 years you're paying in advance. And if you subtract that, then you look at what's remaining for the next year. Yeah. That's what it looks like when he says لا منه إذا كمل النصاب لا منه للحولين, but not from it. Yeah. Not more than 2 years, yeah. And it could be that your wealth diminishes the next year, but you would have already given, what is not obligatory, so it would still be in your favor. And if your wealth increased, then you would have to consider that for the next year. Now you have to make up the amount that increased on your wealth for that year that you prepaid. It might be that my wealth is now, it's just gone way up, and now I have to consider that. The next section he says, وَلَا تُدْفَعُ إِلَّا إِلَى الْأَصْنَافِ الثَّمَانِيَةِ وَهُمُ الْفُقَرَاءُ وَالْمَسَاكِينُ وَالْعَامِلُونَ عَلَيْهَا وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةُ قُلُوبُهُمْ وفي الرقاب والغارمون وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل ويجوز الاقتصار على واحد من صنف وتسن إلى من لا تلزمه مؤنته من أقاربه. It's only to be given to 8 categories: zakat, the poor, the needy, those employed to administer it, those whose hearts are to be reconciled, for the freeing of slaves, debtors in the path of Allah, and the wayfarer. It is permissible to restrict it to one category. It is recommended to give it to relatives for whom one is not financially responsible. So these are the 8 categories, well known. But some important notes here. As for the faqir, because there's fuqara and masakin, the faqir is considered to be the one who finds absolutely nothing at all. They have nothing for themselves. Or they have something, a portion of wealth, but it's not sufficient for them. It's less than half of what they require. That's the marking point here, 50%. They have less than 50% of what they require to live. Whatever it is, maybe they have a job, they have some inheritance, they have something, but it does not fulfill their needs adequately. So this is the faqir. The second is the masakin. The miskin is the needy person, is one who finds most of what they need. They have most of what they need, but it's still insufficient for them. It's like they have less than 100%, but more than half. So they're doing much better than the faqir. It's just they're still not able to, they're still not solvent, if you will. So they have a job, they have some earnings, there's something coming in. It's just not enough to keep them afloat. Al-mu'allafa, those are those that are to be reconciled with, refers to both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, whose influence or potential support for Islam justifies giving them zakat. And this includes community leaders, new Muslims with fragile faith, those likely to bring others to Islam, or influential figures who could help protect Muslims' interests or reduce harm. Zakat can also be given to a non-Muslim to prevent harm from them. However, a Muslim must not accept such zakat if the only reason for giving it is to silence or appease them, as this would be akin to a forbidden bribe. If the intent is to strengthen their faith, to promote loyalty, or encourage good, then it's permissible for them to accept it. So there might be multiple reasons, and as long as there's a permissible reason, then they're permitted to take it. And here you can see this category, which is, to my knowledge, rarely used today. It highlights a broader social purpose of zakat, not just to fulfill basic needs, but also to strategically build alliances, strengthen faith of those who are weakened, and safeguard the Muslim community when needed. So zakat can be utilized for such means. Yes. Later. Okay. Then you have, of course, another category worth noting. Al-Gharim is the debtor. They fall into two main categories. So first is someone who's taken on a debt to reconcile between people, such as like paying blood money or property damages to prevent conflict, even if the dispute is between non-Muslims. Such a person can receive zakat even if wealthy. They have money, but they can receive zakat for this purpose because the funds are not for personal use, but to settle debts, to bring about societal peace. The second type is someone who's fallen into debt for permissible personal needs, like spending on their family or feeding themselves or freeing themselves from captivity. These individuals can also receive zakat if they're unable to repay what they owe. And in this event, the zakat can only be used when received to repay the debt. Right, so you can't take the zakat for a debt and then now use it to make hajj with. A person might be very financially irresponsible. That may be one of the reasons they're in such debt in the first place. And when they do get money to cover those debts, they go, I have a better idea. I'm going to buy a new car because this old one is I'm not feeling it. It's not permissible for them to utilize that zakat money that's been given to them to pay a debt for these things. You can't divert it to other uses. It has to be used to fulfill the intended purposes. And then the last thing I think worth noting is giving zakat to relatives. It's actually encouraged to give your zakat to relatives, those that you're not obliged to spend on in the first place. So we mentioned there's a priority list of those that you're obliged to spend on. So someone you're not obliged to spend on would be like your maternal aunt or uncle, right? Your uncles and your aunties. It's preferred according to based on their need and their relation to you. The Prophet ﷺ says your charity to your relatives is charity and maintaining family ties. So it's a twofold. What should be understood is that you cannot give zakat to a primary inheritor, like your father, your mother, your grandfather, your grandmother, etc. If we go higher than that. Or a secondary inheritor like your son or your grandson and the descendants, or your daughter, unless they qualify in another way, like they're working for the zakat fund. So those that are working for the zakat fund can receive a wage from the zakat itself. Or their hearts need softening. They are dependents, but their hearts need softening. And in this case, you could potentially give zakat to those people you're already obliged to spend on. Or if they're conscripted soldiers, they're in the armed forces. Or a debt. So you're looking at the other categories here. A close relative could receive your zakat if they were applicable to receive it based on these other categories, not because they were in need. Because it's your responsibility as being related to them in that level of relation for you to pay for their needs in the first place. So you wouldn't give zakat to your wife, for example. You're already obliged to spend on her. Or your children. You wouldn't give them zakat money and say, yeah, I've given my zakat to my kids. You're obliged to spend on your children. You have to take care of your family. But then there are those that you're not obliged to spend on, as I mentioned, that are related to you in some degree. Your brother? I don't think he's a direct level of inheritance. Yeah, because he's not from your direct inheritors. Yeah. Yeah. Not a direct, yeah. So that's the rule there. Yes. The next section here, it says, وَمَنْ أُبِيحَ لَهُ أَخْذُ شَيْءٍ أُبِيحَ لَهُ سُؤَالُهُ وَيَجِبُ قُبُولُ مَالٍ طَيِّبٍ أَتَى بِلَا مَسْأَلَةٍ وَلَا اشْتِشْرَافِ نَفْسٍ وإن تفرغ قادر على التكسب للعلم الشرعي لا للعبادة وتعذر الجمع بين التكسب والاشتغال بالعلم أعطي من زكاة لحاجته وإن لم يكن العلم لازما له. Whoever is permitted to receive it is likewise permitted to ask for it. It is obligatory to accept pure wealth that comes without asking or coveting. If one capable of earning a livelihood devotes himself entirely to seeking sacred knowledge, not to mere acts of devotion, and is unable to combine both earning and study, he may be given from zakat according to his needs, even if such knowledge is not personally obligatory for him. Okay, so I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Right, if you are a valid zakat recipient, you can go asking for it. It's perfectly fine. You're permitted to go ask for it. And then if wealth comes to you, that's pure, meaning it's, you know that it's not haram wealth, then you have to take that. And then I think one of the most important points to note in our day and age is using zakat money to pay students of knowledge. That's right. You gotta go out there if you're gonna play. Using your zakat money to pay or sponsor students of knowledge, those that even could earn a wage. It's not like they're unable to work, but they decide to seek knowledge. That's not any type of knowledge. للعلم الشرعي. For Islamic knowledge, sacred knowledge. Like, we're not going to use zakat to send a kid to med school or to get a business degree or computer engineering. That's knowledge. It's just not the knowledge that we're going to support with zakat money. The type of knowledge we're going to support with zakat money is the Islamic knowledge, so that it serves the religion. Right? Zakat can serve the religion, as we've discussed, in many different ways. It serves people, but it also serves the faith and the Muslim community at large. And when you sponsor students of knowledge, you are supporting the faith and the community, because they're the ones that typically are going to carry the religion for the masses. They're going to be the ones that answer the questions, that serve as the leaders, that remind people, that enjoin the good and forbid the evil. They're going to be the ones that are doing all of that in support of the religion and the Muslim community. And so in the event that someone decides, hey, this is what I want to do, I want to dedicate myself to learning Islamic knowledge, and I can't manage both my job and the Islamic knowledge, then in this case, they can be supported with zakat, even if that knowledge is not required for them. And what that means is they're learning about business transactions. They don't engage in business. They're not required to know that because it's not something that they're doing, etc. They don't need to know about the rules and regulations of leaders, imama. They're not doing that. They're not engaged in that personally. That's not a responsibility of theirs to know that. So even in those cases, you can still support them, even if for them the knowledge is theoretical. And as we get close to wrapping up, he says, وَلَا يُجْزِئُ دَفْعُهَا إِلَى كَافِرٍ غَيْرِ مُؤَلَّفٍ وَلَا إِلَى كَامِلِ رِقٍّ غَيْرِ عَامِلٍ وَمُكَاتِبٍ وَلَا إِلَى فَقِيرٍ وَمِسْكِينٍ مستغنيين بنفقة واجبة ولا لبني هاشم هم سلالته ولا مواليهم وإن دفعها لغير مستحقها لجهل ثم علم حاله لم تجزئه إلا لغني ظنه فقيرا. It's not valid to distribute zakat to the following: a non-believer except one whose heart is to be reconciled, a bondservant except one employed for its collection or one under a contract of manumission. Remember, the bondservant's not able to own anything. The poor and the impoverished who are already sufficed by obligatory support. Or Banu Hashim, the Prophet's lineage, or their freed slaves. If it is unknowingly given to one unentitled and the reality is later discovered, it does not suffice, except in the case of a wealthy person presumed to be poor. All right? So one point to mention here is members of the Prophet's his clan, known as Banu Hashim, are not allowed to receive obligatory zakat, based on an authentic hadith that states zakat is the impurities of people's wealth and is therefore not fitting for their noble status, coming from the household of the Prophet ﷺ. And this includes families descended from Hashim, such as the households of Ali, Al-Abbas, Ja'far, Aqil, Al-Harith, and Abu Lahab. They may receive zakat in specific cases, such as when they are debtors or fighting in battle, or if zakat serves a broader benefit like reconciling between people. Some scholars also allowed it if they were not receiving the rightful share of al-khumus, the war spoils. They can receive voluntary charity, ṣadaqah, which is unlike the Prophet ﷺ himself, who never accepted any charity. He would take gifts. He would not take charity whether it was obligatory or voluntary. That was one of the signs of his status as a prophet. And this is one of the signs which Salman al-Farisi tested the Prophet's authenticity. Wanted to give him a gift, a charity, to see if he would accept it, and he said, nope. And then they said, offer it as a gift. And he accepted it as a gift. And he knew he's the one. If someone gives zakat to someone they believe to be poor, but then it turns out they're not actually poor, the zakat will still count. So essentially what the Imam is saying is, beforehand, if you gave zakat to someone of the other categories, thinking that they were eligible, and then you found out they weren't eligible, then you have to pay again. You can't, that's not going to suffice your payment. It hasn't reached where it needs to go. Except for this situation here, as this was, this is based on the Prophet giving to two strong men who later turned out not to be poor, or in need, I should say. Sometimes the financial state is not always obvious. And so the Prophet ﷺ accepted people's outward claims. And so the one that's giving is not accountable in this case based on their financial appearance. The last line we're going to look at, he says, وَتُسَنُّ صَدَقَةُ التَّطَوُّعِ كُلَّ وَقْتٍ وَكَوْنُهَا سِرًّا بِطِيبِ نَفْسٍ فِي صِحَّةٍ وَرَمَضَانَ وَوَقْتِ حَاجَةٍ وَفِي كُلِّ زَمَانٍ وَمَكَانٍ فَاضِلٍ وَعَلَى جَارٍ وَذَوِي رَحِمٍ لَا سِيَّمَا مَعَ عَدَاوَةٍ وَهِيَ صَدَقَةٌ وَصِلَةٌ أَفْضَلُ وَالْمَنُّ بِالصَّدَقَةِ كَبِيرَةٌ وَيَبْطُلُ الثَّوَابُ بِهِ. So voluntary charity, this is what we often refer to as sadaqah, is recommended at all times. It is most virtuous when given secretly with a content heart, بِطِيبِ نَفْسٍ فِي صِحَّةٍ وَرَمَضَانٍ, with a content heart, a pure heart, while in good health, in Ramadan. That's why all the fundraisers are in Ramadan, by the way. It's not like they're just taking advantage of the moment. Like, this is the time in which it's most rewarding to give. It's in Ramadan, So the opportunity is presented in Ramadan as an encouragement for Muslims to take advantage of giving sadaqah during that month to increase their reward. Also in times of need, that's another important point to note about sadaqah, and typically the masajid having their fundraisers in Ramadan, is because that's when they need it. Like when the need is there, that's when you give. When the need's not there, it's welcomed, it's just not as, it doesn't have the same impact. And then at every virtuous time and place. And to a neighbor or a relative, especially when there is enmity. La siyama ma'a adawa. He says, وَعَلَى جَارٍ وَذَوِي رَحِمٍ. Right, to give to your neighbor or to your family member, la siyama ma'a adawa. Especially when there's feelings, when there's tension, to give sadaqah at that moment is even more rewarding because وَهِيَ صَدَقَةٌ وَسِلَةٌ. It's not only charity, but it's bringing things back together, tying it back together, maintaining family ties. And then, of course, he notes, what does he say here? Silatun afdalu wa afdalu wal mannu. To remind of one's charity is a major sin, and it nullifies its reward. And that's when you go back and you say, hey, don't you remember I gave you this and I gave you that and I did this and I did that, and now you're doing this, and I deserve, and I gave, and I spent, and I spent, and I spent. That you just like nullified the whole thing. Nullified the whole thing. Bil manni wal adha, right? The being reminding and harming people from the things that you gave. That should be avoided. And that's what we're going to wrap up for today. Jazakallah khair for your attendance and your attentive listening. Inshallah, we will begin the next chapter of Siyam when we continue. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.